I set out for a solo camping trip in the thick woods a few miles from town. I needed a break from my routine and hoped being alone would clear my head. The drive was smooth, and I got to my campsite in the late afternoon. I parked my car, grabbed my stuff, and headed into the forest. The trees grew denser the further I went. After about an hour, I found a small open area by a stream. It seemed perfect. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and lit a small campfire. As the sun went down, the forest around me turned into a world of shadows and sounds. I tried to ignore the rustling in the bushes and the occasional snap of a twig. The night got colder. I wrapped myself in a blanket, sitting by the fire, lost in thought. That's when I first heard it. A faint rustling, different from the usual sounds of the forest. It was deliberate, moving closer. I turned my flashlight toward the sound but saw nothing. I tried to brush it off as an animal, but a chill ran down my spine. I decided to get some sleep, hoping to shake off the unease. I climbed into my tent, zipped it up, and lay down. The forest was eerily quiet now, except for the occasional hoot of an owl. Just as I started to drift off, I heard it again. The same rustling, but now it was right outside my tent. My heart pounded in my chest. I held my breath, listening closely. The sound circled my tent slowly, purposefully. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but I saw nothing. The rustling stopped. I waited, straining my ears for any hint of movement. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. Finally, I convinced myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I lay back down, but sleep wouldn't come. I kept listening, every nerve on edge. Around midnight, I heard it again, louder this time. It was followed by a soft thud, like something heavy had been dropped nearby. Fear gripped me. I knew I wasn't alone out here. I didn't dare make a sound. Morning couldn't come soon enough. As the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, I packed my gear quickly. The forest, which seemed so inviting in the daylight, now felt menacing. As I was leaving the clearing, I saw it, a deep, fresh footprint in the soft earth near my tent. It was human and much larger than my own. My heart raced as I realized someone had been watching me all night. I hurried back to my car, constantly looking over my shoulder, feeling eyes on me the entire way. Driving away, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Just as I turned onto the main road, I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw a dark figure standing at the edge of the woods, watching me. My blood ran cold. I sped up, not daring to look back again. I promised myself I'd never camp alone again. But even now, days later, I can't get rid of the feeling that I'm still being watched. Everywhere I go, I feel those eyes on me. At home, at work, even in crowded places. I haven't slept well since that night, and I'm starting to see shadows in the corners of my eyes. Whoever, or whatever, was out there is not done with me yet. And I can't escape the chilling thought that one night, when I'm least expecting it, they'll come back for me. Camping in the woods had always been a peaceful getaway for me. I enjoyed the quiet, the solitude, and the chance to unplug from everyday life. This trip was meant to be no different. I drove to a secluded spot, far from the nearest town, and set up my tent beside a small, clear stream. The first day went well. I spent it fishing, reading, and exploring the forest. As the sun went down, I made a fire, cooked my meal, and enjoyed the serene sounds of nature. When night fell, the temperature dropped, and I crawled into my tent, cozy in my sleeping bag. In the middle of the night, I woke up to a strange noise, rustling outside my tent. I thought it might be an animal, so I tried to ignore it and go back to sleep. But the rustling continued, getting closer and more deliberate. I lay still, trying to figure out what it was. My heart pounded when I heard something brushing against the tent. Then I heard the zipper of my tent start to move. Panic surged through me, and I grabbed the small knife I always kept nearby. The zipper stopped halfway, and everything went quiet again. I held my breath, clutching the knife, my eyes locked on the partially open tent flap. The minutes dragged on, feeling like hours, and the silence was unbearable. Then I heard it, a low, raspy breath just outside the tent. I couldn't see anything in the dark, but I felt like someone, or something, was right there. Fear took over. I knew I had to do something, but I was frozen. After what felt like forever, the zipper moved again, this time slowly being pulled down, almost as if to taunt me. I could see a shadowy shape against the dim moonlight. My mind raced with possibilities: a wild animal, a prankster camper, or something far worse. I realized I couldn't stay in the tent. I had to face whatever was outside. I gathered all my courage, pushed open the tent flap, and jumped outside with the knife in hand. The figure darted away, vanishing into the trees with a speed that felt unnatural. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat by the dying fire, gripping my knife, listening for any sign of the intruder's return. The forest was eerily silent, and every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves sent chills down my spine. As soon as dawn broke, I packed up my gear and hurried back to my car, constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure watching me from the trees. When I finally reached the safety of my vehicle, a wave of relief washed over me. I drove away, leaving the campsite behind, but the memory of that night lingered. I never camped alone again. The woods, once a haven, had become a source of dread. But even as I tried to move on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. Every time I walked through the forest or heard a rustle in the distance, I felt that same chill, the unsettling sense that I was still being watched, that whatever was out there had not gone away but was simply waiting, hidden just beyond the light. Camping was supposed to be my getaway, a break from the noisy city. I picked a remote spot deep in the forest, far from any trails. I got there in the early afternoon, set up my tent, and gathered some firewood. The forest was peaceful, the air fresh, and the sounds of nature were soothing. As the sun started to go down, I built a fire and cooked dinner. It was perfect, just what I needed. Night came fast, and with it, an uneasy quiet. The usual forest sounds seemed to vanish, replaced by a creepy silence. I brushed it off, thinking my mind was playing tricks on me. I crawled into my tent and tried to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Around midnight, I heard a rustling outside. At first, I thought it was an animal, but the sounds were too careful, too human. My heart raced as I lay still, listening. The rustling turned into footsteps, slow and cautious, moving around my campsite. I held my breath, hoping it was just my imagination. The footsteps grew louder, stopping right outside my tent. I could hear breathing, heavy and strained. Fear took hold of me as I lay there, frozen, trying to stay quiet. After what felt like forever, the footsteps moved away, fading into the forest. I stayed awake the rest of the night, too scared to move. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I unzipped my tent slowly. My campsite looked untouched, but I knew what I had heard. I packed up quickly, eager to leave. As I was about to leave, I noticed something on the ground near my tent. It was a footprint, clearly human, leading away from my camp and into the woods. I didn't waste any more time. I hurried back to my car, constantly looking over my shoulder, feeling like I was being watched. When I finally reached my car, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I drove away, leaving the forest behind, but the memory of that night stayed with me. It wasn't until I got home and did some searching that I found out about the disappearances. Several campers had gone missing in that forest over the past few years. The footprints and the creepy silence now made sense. I had been lucky to make it out. The experience changed me. I still enjoy the outdoors, but I never camp alone anymore. The forest, once a place of peace, now holds a dark memory. The fear of the unknown, of what might be lurking in the shadows, is something I can't forget. The footsteps outside my tent, the feeling of being watched, it's all too real, a reminder of how close I came to disappearing into the darkness. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear those footsteps in my dreams. They start slow and cautious, just like that night, circling my bed instead of my tent. I wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, convinced that if I close my eyes again, I'll open them to find those footprints leading right into my room. The forest may be far away, but the terror it left behind is always with me. I'd been excited about this camping trip for weeks, needing a break from the constant noise and stress of everyday life. My friend and I picked a remote spot deep in the woods, far from any campgrounds. The place was ideal, quiet, peaceful, and surrounded by tall pine trees. We set up our tent in the late afternoon, and as night came, we started a small fire. The crackling flames and the smell of burning wood were soothing. I'd brought my guitar along and played a few chords, enjoying the peace. After a while, my friend went to bed, leaving me alone by the fire. The forest was dark and still. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and a distant owl hooting. Around midnight, I heard something strange, a low, rhythmic thumping noise coming from the woods. At first, I thought it might be a deer or some other animal. But as the thumping went on, I started to feel uneasy. It was too regular, too deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and walked towards the noise. The beam cut through the darkness, showing nothing but trees and bushes. The thumping stopped as soon as I got close, and the silence that followed was even more unsettling. I looked around, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. Back at the campfire, I tried to calm myself, convincing myself it was just my imagination. I threw more wood on the fire and sat by the flames, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. The firelight flickered across the trees, casting long, spooky shadows. After a while, I heard the thumping again, but it was closer this time. It was louder and more urgent. My heart pounded in my chest. I picked up a heavy stick for protection and went back into the woods, determined to find out what was making the noise. I ventured deeper, the thumping growing louder with each step. I felt like I was being led somewhere, and my anxiety grew. Then I saw it, a large, rough hole in the ground, freshly dug and about 6 feet deep. The thumping noise was coming from below, a dull, rhythmic pounding that seemed to shake the earth. My mind raced. I realized someone, or something, was down there. The thumping grew more frantic, like whoever was down there was desperate to get out. I stumbled back to the campsite, my heart racing. I packed up our gear quickly, my hands shaking as I worked. I couldn't leave without my friend, so I woke them and told them we had to leave right away. We packed up as fast as we could and drove away from that place, the thumping sound still ringing in my ears. The drive home was silent, both of us lost in our own thoughts. When we got home, I told the local authorities about what happened. They investigated but found no signs of recent activity or anyone in trouble. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had narrowly escaped something terrifying. To this day, the thought of that rhythmic thumping chills me to the bone. Sometimes, late at night, I can still hear that sound in my head, a haunting reminder of what might have been waiting for us in that hole. I can't help but wonder if it was someone trapped or something far more sinister, and whether it's still out there, waiting for the next unwary camper to wander too close. I'd been looking forward to this weekend camping trip for weeks. I needed a break from the constant noise and stress of city life and thought a couple of days in the woods would be just what I needed. I got to the campsite late in the afternoon and set up my tent in a small clearing surrounded by thick trees. As the sun went down, long shadows stretched across the clearing, and I felt a chill I attributed to the evening air. I built a fire and cooked some food, enjoying the crackling flames and the calm of the forest. As night settled in, the only sounds were leaves rustling and the occasional call of distant animals. I felt a bit uneasy, but I chalked it up to being in a new place. I decided to go to bed early so I could get a good night's sleep and explore the area in the morning. Just as I was starting to drift off, A series of loud, strange noises outside jolted me awake. It sounded like something heavy was moving around, and I could hear twigs snapping. My heart raced, and I tried to ignore it, but the noises continued. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent, peering out into the dark. The light from my flashlight swept over the campsite, but I saw nothing unusual. I turned off the light and listened closely, trying to figure out what was making the noise. It seemed to be getting closer. I felt a growing sense of fear. Deciding to check things out, I thought maybe an animal had come into my campsite. I stepped outside, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The noises had stopped, and the forest was unnervingly quiet. I walked around the clearing, shining the light everywhere. I soon noticed something unsettling: large, human-like footprints in the dirt. They were deep and heavy, leading away from my tent and into the woods. Panic hit me hard. I didn't want to be alone in the woods anymore, but I had to find out what was going on. I followed the footprints carefully, trying to stay as quiet as I could. The forest was dense, and the darkness was nearly total. As I went further into the woods, I stumbled upon a small, makeshift campfire and some scattered belongings: an old backpack, a torn blanket, and a half-empty water bottle. The sight made my blood run cold. Someone had been here recently. The thought of not being alone made my heart race even faster. I scanned the area and saw a shadowy figure in the distance. It was too dark to make out any details, but it looked like a person. I froze, unsure of what to do. My gut told me to leave immediately. I turned and ran back to my tent, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I reached my tent, quickly packed up my things, and decided to leave right away. Relief washed over me when I was finally in my car, speeding away from the campsite. As I drove, the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. It was as if the eyes of the forest were still on me. The next morning, I reported what I had seen to the local authorities. They promised they would look into it. When I went back to the area a week later, everything had been cleaned up. There were no signs of the previous occupant. The authorities said someone had been living in the woods for a while but had left before they arrived. That experience left me shaken. I learned the hard way that the wilderness is unpredictable and can be much more dangerous than I ever imagined. To this day, I still feel uneasy about that trip. The thought of what might have happened if I had stayed a bit longer makes my skin crawl. The sense of being watched never quite left me, and I wonder if there are still eyes in the dark woods, waiting for the next camper to come too close. It was a clear night when I decided to go camping alone. I found a quiet spot by a lake deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. The air was cool, the stars bright, and the only sound was the gentle splash of water against the shore. I set up my tent and built a small fire, feeling happy in the silence. As the fire crackled, I noticed the forest seemed oddly still. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. It felt strange, but I shrugged it off, thinking it was because I was far from everything. After cooking a simple meal, I crawled into my tent, leaving the fire to burn down to embers. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. My heart was racing, and I didn't know why. I listened carefully, trying to figure out what had woken me. Then I heard it, a soft crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. It was coming from the direction of the trees. My first thought was an animal, but the steps were too slow and steady. Slowly, I unzipped the tent, trying to be as quiet as possible. The moonlight cast long shadows across the campsite, but I saw nothing unusual. The sound stopped, and for a moment, everything was eerily quiet again. I sat there, straining my ears, when the sound started again, this time closer. My skin crawled with fear. I grabbed the flashlight and pointed it towards the noise. The light cut through the darkness, but showed nothing. The steps stopped again. Whoever, or whatever, it was, seemed to be playing a game, staying just out of sight. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Every time I thought it was safe to relax, the footsteps would start up again, never coming too close. but never leaving. By dawn, I was exhausted but glad to see the sun rise. I decided to pack up and leave. The forest that had seemed peaceful now felt threatening. As I took down my tent, I felt eyes on me, watching my every move. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, but I didn't turn around. I didn't want to see what might be there. Walking back to my car, I kept glancing over my shoulder. I half expected to see someone or something following me, but the path stayed empty. When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear in the back, got in, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I turned the key in the ignition. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror one last time. At the edge of the woods, just visible in the morning light, was a figure. It stood still, watching me leave. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew it had been there all night, stalking me. Weeks passed, and I tried to forget about that night. But the memory of those footsteps in the dark, and the figure in the woods, stayed with me. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew better. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard the same faint crunching sound outside my window. My heart pounded as I got up and looked out, but saw nothing. The steps stopped, and the silence was deafening. That's when I realized, whatever had been watching me in the woods had followed me home. The plan was simple, a solo camping trip to clear my mind. I drove out to a quiet forest, found a hidden spot by a small creek, and set up my tent. The first day was perfect. I walked around a bit, fished, and enjoyed the peace and quiet. By nightfall, I had a small fire going and settled in for the night. Around midnight, I woke up to a strange sound. It wasn't an animal. It was a faint, steady tapping, like something or someone was hitting a tree. I ignored it, thinking it was just the forest's noises, and tried to go back to sleep. The tapping continued, getting closer and louder. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside the tent, looking around. The sound stopped suddenly. Everything was still. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I felt like I was being watched, but I couldn't see anything unusual. I went back inside the tent, but I couldn't sleep. I lay there, listening closely. Then I heard something new, soft footsteps circling my campsite. I gripped my knife, my heart pounding. The footsteps grew bolder, closer, until they stopped just outside the tent. For what felt like forever, I listened, waiting for something to happen. Then, the tent fabric rustled slightly, as if something brushed against it. I held my breath. Suddenly, the tent flaps started to open. My mind raced. I had no time to think. I lunged forward, knife in hand, and slashed wildly at the darkness. The sound stopped. I scrambled out of the tent, flashlight and knife ready. There was nothing. No sign of anyone or anything. Just the empty forest, silent and dark. My hands were shaking. I couldn't stay here. I quickly packed up my stuff, throwing everything into my backpack, and started heading back to my car. As I walked, the feeling of being watched never left. Every rustle, every snap of a twig, sent shivers down my spine. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something following me. But the forest stayed empty and silent. I reached my car just as the first light of dawn broke. I tossed my gear into the back seat, got in, and locked the doors. My hands were still trembling as I started the engine and sped away from the campsite. Even now, I can't shake the feeling of those eyes on me, watching. I haven't been camping since. The forest that once felt like a safe place now feels like a trap. Every night, I lock my doors and windows, haunted by the memory of that tapping sound, wondering who or what it was that found me in the middle of nowhere. And sometimes, when I'm lying in bed, I hear it again. That same faint, steady tapping, as if it's coming from the trees outside my window. I know it's impossible, but the fear grips me all the same. I lie awake, staring into the dark, wondering if it's just my mind playing tricks on me, or if something truly found me that night and followed me home.